Hello and welcome to another episode. My name is Matt O'Leary, and today we are joined by special guest River Wells, who covers the Tampa Bay Buccaneers for the Bucs Wire. River, how's it going, my man?
It's going pretty good. How about yourself?
Doing well. Excited to have you on and talk about this joint practice we saw earlier today from the Bucs and the Jets, and get into a little bit of preview of what we can expect in this game coming up on Saturday. But first thing I have for you is how are you guys enjoying the Todd Bowles experience down there in Tampa Bay as head coach? That's something we share in common as he was the head coach of the New York Jets from 2015 through 2018.
Right. And Bowles, from a defensive standpoint, has been everything as advertised. He usually has very good defensive units that he's put together, and his play calling is generally varied. It's definitely hard to play against. I know Aaron Rodgers has said in the past that Bowles is one of the toughest coordinators to play against in the NFL, and I think that still remains true. There's definitely a test for Bowles coming into his second year at the Bucs. A lot of clock management questions that fans have, a lot of going for it on fourth down, analytical stuff like that he's been often criticized for. So those are things that will definitely be under scrutiny for him, and that he has to go out and prove that, like his tenure with the Jets previously, he still has the ability to be a head coach in this league.
Yeah, unfortunately, that sounds all too familiar for things that we saw here in New York. But you're 100% right. There's no question that he's a very talented and smart defensive mind in this league, and you know that team is going to be good and on the defensive side of the ball. And when you look at this Jets team, it kind of gets compared to the recent Tampa Bay Buccaneers when they bring in Tom Brady, a veteran quarterback who was with one team for a long time. He comes in, wins a Super Bowl with the Bucs, and they make the playoffs 3 years in a row. The Jets often get compared to the Buccaneers. Do you see that comparison? Does that make sense to you? And what could Jet fans kind of expect with getting a veteran quarterback to come in here with a younger roster?
Well, sure. There's definitely some parallels there. When Tom Brady came to the Bucs in 2020, there was already a great defense there for him, and that was kind of masked a bit because Jameis Winston would often throw interceptions on the Bucs side of the field, which would not go well because they would have to face off against teams that were starting at the 30, the 35, and then would score a lot of points. But that defensive unit was always pretty impressive. So similar thing with Aaron Rodgers, obviously going to the Jets, and the Jets defensive unit last year was vaunted with guys like Sauce Gardner and Quinn Williams and all that. So definitely a similar parallel there, and it all depends on how a lot of people think about Aaron Rodgers heading into this year. Me personally, I think he can still play football at a high level. He didn't last year in Green Bay, but it's possible that there were a lot of surrounding circumstances that contributed to that. But it's that QB away situation we always talk about with teams, and the Bucs were kind of that type of team. Brady obviously helped lure some free agents over to Tampa Bay to help complete the roster, and we saw Aaron Rodgers got some of his old weapons from Green Bay back, and with his pay cut he took, he could possibly bring in some more people. But yeah, it'll be interesting as long as the defense doesn't regress over there in New York, which that's a tough thing to ask of any defense. They often do regress year to year, then they should be a fairly competitive football team, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that us as Jet fans are really excited about to see a quarterback of that caliber. Now, getting to practice, today between these two teams, it seemed a little chippy today. The two sides were going at it a little bit. What were some of your takeaways from the joint practice?
Well, chippiness always comes with joint practice, I think, no matter who's playing who. And it's interesting they had only one joint practice. They're not going to do two, possibly to prevent that thing, but that it didn't seem to work in the end. Joint practice was interesting from what I've heard. Bucks had a lot of sacks today in joint practice on Aaron Rodgers. The defensive line generally dominated. I saw Anthony Nelson, outside linebacker for the Bucks, had a pick six on Zach Wilson as well. I actually just saw the clip before hopping on. It was not pretty from a Zach Wilson perspective. Uh, but and then Russell Gage is the biggest story. Went down with a season-ending injury, what it seems like, and he was slated to be the Bucs wide receiver 3 this year. And behind Russell Gage, depth is a huge question. They've got David Moore, who played with offensive coordinator Dave Canales in Seattle, and beyond David Moore and not including Chris Godwin and Mike Evans, everyone is basically a rookie. Devin Tompkins has the most experience aside from that group. He's been in the NFL for 2 years. So huge depth implications there. But wide receiver Trey Palmer for the Bucs looks like he continues to show out in preseason and practice. Had a 60-yard touchdown pass from Kyle Trask over Sauce Gardner. From what I understand, the Jets were in cover zero there, so Sauce had to fight him one-on-one, which is tough. But Palmer's very fast. He's had some great catches in camp, and he definitely impressed catching a touchdown pass from Baker Mayfield against the Steelers. So a player to watch, perhaps, for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers going forward.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's obviously a shame with Gage, and unfortunately, that's something that tends to happen in these joint practices. I feel like that's, that unfortunately is something that comes up. It was 2 years ago now, but the Jets had a joint practice with the Packers, and they lost Carl Lawson for the season, and like it just stinks when you're trying to get more out of your guys when you're going up against different opponents and just showing them
Right.
something different, and you suffer an injury like that. And you mentioned the sacks, which to me, that was a huge storyline from practice today. From your perspective as someone who, covers the Bucs and watches the Bucs, are they like supposed to have this dominant unit on the defensive line? Like, is that one of their strengths? So the reason why I asked that is because there's been a little bit of concern with the Jets offensive line and trying to gauge just like how good of a unit they were going up against today.
Weird answer, yes and no.
Okay.
There's a lot of talent on that Bucs offensive line, especially in the interior. You got Vita Vea there, and the Bucs first round pick Kalijah Cansey is currently nursing a calf injury. He's not out there, but when he was out there initially in training camp, he was pretty impressive. So he wasn't there today. Um, a lot of really good stuff on the interior line. Greg Gaines from LA, the Rams, came in as a debt piece, but edge rusher is a bit of a question for the Bucs. Shaq Barrett's coming back from an Achilles injury at about 30 years old, which is very tough. And on the other side, you've got Joe Tryon-Shoyinka, which for the Bucs has sometimes had these really nice flashes of athleticism where he can beat his man, but he's had a lot of trouble finishing his reps, and he's not very good so far, at least in my opinion, in the run game. So he's looking to improve. And then behind him, you've got Anthony Nelson, who I mentioned earlier, who actually had more sacks than Tryon-Shoyinka last year as his backup. So edge rushing has been a bit of a question, but the interior defensive line I think is pretty strong. So it'll be interesting to see how that comes together. From what I understand, the Jets' offensive line has had some questions going into camp, particularly with guys like Mekhi Becton and the surrounding line. So I'm interested to see how, from your perspective, how that goes as well, because I've been on the internet and I've heard two sides of this whole thing with the Bucs and the Jets. So yeah.
Yeah, for the Jets, they are missing a couple of starters right now, like Laken Tomlinson, who's going to be their starting left guard, didn't practice today. Elijah Vera Tucker, who is their best overall offensive lineman, can
Right.
play guard and tackle. He's been slotted in at right guard. He didn't practice today. And Dwayne Brown, who's expected to be the left tackle, he hasn't practiced at all yet. That Robert Saleh keeps saying soon he'll come back, and
Yeah.
it's getting late early around here, so that's worrying some fans. But overall, Mekhi Becton's been hurt the last 2 years, so he's working his way back. They've pretty much exclusively kept him at left tackle and running with the twos to kind of ease him back in. But after practice today, Saleh mentioned getting him some reps on the right side and potentially some first team reps. So that offensive line's a little bit of a work in progress right now. It's probably not close to what it's going to be on opening night against the Bills in a few weeks, but still a little bit of a concern that you're now at the midway point through August, and your expected starting five hasn't been able to get out there and practice yet.
Right.
So while yes, like part of the thing is people are worried, and the other half of the fan base says, don't worry about it. It's not their starting five guys. But at the same time, you got to be able to build up chemistry before you're out
Right.
of week one.
The Bucs are having a similar problem actually in camp right now with the status of center Ryan Jensen, who has been practicing occasionally, but he has not done any 11-on-11 work, has not done any 7-on-7 work, and he recently missed 2 days in a row for the first time, Sunday and Monday. So there's a growing concern among Bucs fans and some of the people who cover the team that Jensen's status might be interesting going into the regular season, where initially we heard he was on a plan to recovery. He didn't get surgery last year in hopes of playing in a wild card game against Dallas, and he did. But his status will certainly be a major question, and it's getting a little murkier, I think, as training camp has gone along. So they've had Nick Leverett and Robert Hainsey are the two competing players for that backup center job, and like you said, Jensen hasn't been able to feel the chemistry with an almost brand new offensive line this year, so that's definitely a concern heading into the season for Tampa Bay.
Absolutely. And just while you're mentioning on some of these changes on the offense for Tampa Bay, another kind of connection to something that Jet fans know well. Down in Tampa, or just from the fans or people who cover their team, is there any concern with the constant rotation of coordinators with Todd Bowles? Because he went through, it was 3 coordinators in 4 years with the Jets, and now made a change at coordinator again going into this year. Is that something that's brought up a lot, or any sort of concern from the Tampa Bay folks?
Well, it should be interesting to know, and I'll give Bowles some credit here. He inherited Bruce Arians' team last year because Arians stepped down right before the season started, and Bowles promoted to head coach. And so part of that promotion was that he had offensive coordinator Byron Leftwich, and Leftwich was scrutinized by fans and some pundits before that happened, even when these teams were good. And he had a notably, in my opinion at least, pretty bad year last year and was fired because of that. And I think if you talk to a lot of Bucs fans, I don't think any of them miss Byron Leftwich.
Okay.
So Canales is a young mind, and it's someone that Todd Bowles picked himself, which is probably pretty big on his part. And Canales worked with the Seahawks last year as their quarterbacks coach, and look what happened with Geno Smith. So there's a lot of buzz going around with the Canales. I've talked to him. We've all talked to him in the media, and we're very impressed with how he speaks about the offense and his young ideas. So I think actually a lot of people are pretty happy with bringing Canales. And if it wasn't Canales, anyone else, because Leftwich was not particularly well loved, particularly in his last year at Tampa Bay, I would say.
Okay. There we go. Just was curious on that angle. And
Yeah.
before we get into some more things to expect for Saturday, something else that Jet fans and Bucks fans have in common is Jordan Whitehead, someone who spent a lot of time down in Tampa Bay. He was there 4 years before he came over to the New York Jets this past year. Jet fans a little frustrated with him after 1 year. Missed tackles a little bit of an issue. Is that something you notice down in Tampa Bay? Is that something that could get cleaned up, or is that kind of just who he is as a player?
Whitehead loves to hit. That's what I'll say about that. He's a really big fan of it, and he was definitely, when he made contact, the whole stadium could feel it. But with that, sometimes, like you mentioned, that comes with going for hits instead of wrapping up, stuff like that, which I have not been paying too much attention. Last year, I didn't really get a lot of film on Whitehead, but those type of tacklers can sometimes suffer from that sort of thing, going for a big hit instead of wrapping up and going for the safe tackle. He was a missile back when he played for Tampa Bay, and when he made his plays, he made his plays. But based on the way that he likes to attack the football and really hit hard, he's one of the hardest hitters I've seen in a while. At least when he played for Tampa Bay, it was. That makes sense with that sort of. So that would be something he'd have to work on for sure, I think, going forward.
Yeah, that's kind of seems like a trend here. As for let's transition a little bit. We'll get into some things to look for in this game coming up. Just overall, what are some positional battles that Bucks fans are watching for in this game?
Well, the biggest one's quarterback,
Yeah.
obviously. You've got Baker Mayfield and Kyle Trask. Kyle Trask will be starting on Saturday against the New York Jets. Baker Mayfield got the start against the Pittsburgh Steelers. Looked really good, went 8 for 9 with a beautiful touchdown pass to Trey Palmer. So Trask has limited turnovers in camp a lot better overall. I think Baker showed out in the preseason game, so he probably pulled ahead in that instance. So Trask might need a big splash against the Jets to really kind of even the odds out there. So that's a big one. Like I mentioned before, Leverett and Hainsey could become very important because of Ryan Jensen's status. We don't know. Todd Bowles hasn't given us any updates on that, but it's becoming a question as more time passes. So that's definitely something to watch. And of course, wide receiver 3 is now a pretty decent battle with Russell Gage down. Trey Palmer is going to be fighting for that spot as he's looked pretty good. Devin Tompkins might legitimately be the smallest player in the entire National Football League. I think he's 5'8", 151, but He has incredible ups. He's made plays all through camp, and him and Baker seem to have a really good rapport together. So that's a name to watch. And then David Moore came over from the Seahawks. Now it's working with him, the only other veteran really left besides Godwin and Evans. So that'll be interesting. And then finally, you've got a kicking competition, which is kind of fun. You got Chase McLaughlin and Rodrigo Blankenship going head to head. I will say I think McLaughlin's pretty handily in the lead based on what we've seen at camp. Blankenship's missed quite a few kicks in camp, but under the lights is always different. So expect to see two different kickers. Expect to see them maybe from some varying distances as well. That could be fun.
Yeah, absolutely. And just going back to the quarterback, because I think that's one that most fans are going to be
For sure. Yeah.
keeping a close eye on. It seemed like they've been going kind of back and forth between Trask and Baker, and giving them each an opportunity to win that starting job. Do you have a sense, just based on what you've seen so far, and I guess what we saw in the first preseason game? Is there a leader in the clubhouse? Are you guys expecting Baker to start, or do you think Trask could actually win this thing?
Trask had a pretty good hold on things before that preseason game. I will maintain, but I think when you're under the lights, that's what matters most, and in game live scenarios. And in that case, Baker, like I said, had a great game. I think in Steelers preseason game, and Trask threw a pick on his first drive in there. So that game time scenarios is probably what Vols will be looking at more. Vols did tell us he's looking at both training camp and preseason games, but that lifetime experience I think is pretty valuable. So I would say I initially thought Trask looked better over the course of the first few weeks of training camp, and I did write about that. But as of right now, with how Baker played in the preseason game, I'm going to give the edge to him. The way I put it, Baker has thrown more picks in camp. He's way more willing to take risks with the football than Kyle Trask has been. Trask has limited his turnovers, but his deep ball hasn't been great. And he hit one day, but his deep ball hasn't been great, and he's a lot less willing to try and make things happen than Baker does. Which sometimes it bites Baker, sometimes it doesn't. But I think that allows him to make those bigger plays.
Yeah, absolutely. And going against this Jets defense on Sunday, I wouldn't anticipate a ton of the starters playing, but this past week against Carolina, their second team defensive line was dominant against even the Panthers starters. So I think it'll be a
I
good
saw some
test.
Bryce Young clips of him getting
Yeah.
hit by those Jets. That was tough. Yeah.
Yeah, it very well could be a long day for both those quarterbacks, but I think it'll be a good test for both Trask and Baker to kind of see how far along they are, even if
Right.
you're not getting the Sauce Gardners or Quinnen Williams or Carl, like guys like that playing in this game. That defensive line they rotated a lot, so it's 10 deep. Like their number twos can play. So
Yeah.
I think it'll be an interesting test to see how both those guys do against this defense.
Absolutely. I think that's what a lot of players on the team are excited about.
So we have a question from the chat, and if anyone else in the chat wants to chime in with some questions, we can get those over for River. It's from Blitzcrew, says, who on the Bucs may be cut or traded? So I mean, you don't have to go through, who's going to make this whole 53 and the 40 guys are going to cut, but maybe some names that would be a surprise or unexpected. And obviously expectations a little bit different this year for Tampa based on years past. Could you see them maybe selling off some pieces at the deadline?
The thing to remember about this Bucs team is that it's very, very young, right? There's a ton of rookies on this roster because a lot of the holdovers from the Brady era left. The guys like Leonard Fournette, Julio Jones, Sean Perryman, a lot of those guys ended up going in free agency. So as far as notable cuts, I don't foresee anything crazy. There's a few battles here and there. I talked a little bit about the Bucs have an outside linebacker named Cam Gill, who's been on the team for a while at special teams. I initially thought he might be on the bubble because the Bucs drafted a lot of really young edge rushers in the draft, but I think he's actually going to make the team after his performance in Pittsburgh. As far as selling off the deadline, I don't think so. I've heard a lot of chat and discussion about Mike Evans over the past few weeks, and I would say Mike told us that he wants to be a Buck for life. And if the Bucs end up picking high in the draft next year and they end up having another quarterback chance, you would want a veteran guy like that on your roster, I think. So I think they'll probably get an extension done if not before the end of training camp, decently soon. I think that's going to happen. Chris Godwin is a player, maybe not this year at the trade deadline, but in future years might end up being moved simply because he's going to command a lot of money, and he's a really, really, really solid wide receiver too. Is very talented. So I don't know about this year for a trade, but that's a name going forward that might depart the team possibly, or they can get an extension done. The Bucs have had a lot of really good cap room work with their cap guy Mike Greenberg has done pretty well, but eventually it's going to be hard to pay everybody on this team, especially with this talented wide receiver room and some pillars in the defense. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like they're in an interesting spot. Like I've seen a ton of articles actually linking like a Mike Evans or a Godwin to the Jets. At
Yeah, I saw Bill Barlow had one with Mike Evans, the Jets, which I wrote a little bit about, but I personally don't see it happening, or at least I think it'd be unlikely. But you never really know, So it'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, no, for sure. And that kind of goes to that next point because I feel like a lot of people, the expectation is that they will be picking pretty high in the draft and likely taking their quarterback of the future. Like you could theoretically sell off some of your better wide receivers who are
Right.
veterans to get more draft capital, which could help, but also then that kind of makes it a life a little bit more difficult on whatever quarterback you're drafting if they don't have that weapon.
Mhm.
So I'm curious to see like what the take is there from the fan base, if they would rather sell off and get the extra draft capital and like fully tank this year, or if they'd rather hang on to some of these guys for that next eventual guy next year.
I will say Mike Evans is very beloved among the Buccaneers fan base to the point where I've seen a lot of fans online say that the only thing they hope for is that Mike continues his 1,000-yard streak, and that's the main goal for the season. I have the coaching staff will agree with that, but I've seen a lot of sentiment there. I personally think this team's a bit too talented to be picking in the top 3 or 5, which might present a problem going forward. I have them personally at 5-12 is my prediction. My writer Jason Cano at Bucs Wire, who is very knowledgeable, has them at 7-10, which is about been the high side for me, but a possibility. Um, yeah, I think at some point you gotta sell off. It's gotta happen. People are kind of scared of the word rebuild, but I think should the Bucs not perform well this year, people in the building would know what's up and would start taking those steps. So yeah, there are a lot of talented players in the team that need extensions. Could go. I mean, Anton Winfield Jr. is another safety who is a free agent coming up, and that's going to be a pretty big decision because he's very talented. Devin White is going to be a free agent, and there's a lot of discourse on Devin White between Bucs fans and pundits. He's a very controversial figure in that regard, but that's a decision they're going to have to make. So definitely looking forward, the team might look a little bit different in a few years.
Yeah, absolutely. Snowball wants to know. We talked about it a little bit at the start, but what's the fan opinion on Bulls? Do they want him gone, or are they fully comfortable with him being the guy to help them through this rebuilding process?
So of course, this is my experience with Bucs fans. I live in Tampa Bay. I'm around them a lot. I'm online. In my experience, Bowles gets criticized pretty heavily, and a lot of that has to go with the Browns game last year was a notable one where he didn't go for it in fourth and short situation, which ended up taking that game to overtime, and the Bucs lost. You've got some clock management issues. The way he handled Ryan Suckup last year, who had a very bad range with his leg, and Bowles would often trot him out for 50-plus yard kicks that he was just shown to leave short in practice and in pregame drills. It's mostly the decision-making aspect there. I don't think anyone, well, maybe a few people, but I think most people know that Bowles' defenses are usually top 10 in the league. Great defensive mind with play calling. But it's those head coaching aspects that often get criticized for Bowles. And I think that's something he really has to prove he can manage in 2023. It's going to be a big year for him, for sure. So he does get his flack. The players love him. He's definitely a player's coach, I think. And people in the building obviously like him since he's still here. But we'll see what happens for sure. It'll be a test for him.
Yeah, and that again, like I said earlier too, that sounds very similar to his experience with the
Yeah,
Jets. Like he's an easy guy to root for. He's a likable guy, great defensive mind, but he just makes some decisions that leaves you scratching your head, whether it be, punting on fourth down late in the game or, you
he's a
know,
very conservative coach in that regard,
yeah.
and that definitely in the modern NFL era where analytics are dominating and where coaches are more willing to take risk and are being rewarded for it, a lot of fans definitely aren't happy with that sort of aspect of his coaching.
Yeah, absolutely. And you kind of mentioned what your expectation, but you had them at 5-12. In this, that's what's interesting too about this team. The NFC South feels like a division that could be
For
won
sure.
9 or 10 wins. So
Yeah,
I feel like it's hard for them to really sell off because you don't know. I mean, if Baker can come in and give you, 75% of the guy he was in Cleveland, who knows? Maybe you get hot and you get in, with 9 wins and winning that
absolutely.
division. So yeah, I don't think that 5 or 7 win prediction is really all that crazy, even though it feels like most people have the Bucks picking in the top 3 to 5, but based on
Yeah, which I think personally, I think that just you got Carlton Davis and Jamel Dean, Chris Godwin, Mike Evans. A lot of question marks around Tristan Wirfs with the decision to move him, which has also proved very controversial. But you still have him on your line. Levante David was a top three coverage linebacker in the league last year, I think, and he came back to Tampa Bay. So a lot of talent still on this team. A lot of questions, which is why quarterback, offensive line is a huge question. But top three, like a 3-14 season, I would be shocked if they were that bad. But I think there's definitely a ceiling with Baker Mayfield and Kyle Trask and offensive line and questions surrounding Bowles' ability to coach and that'll all come into play.
No, absolutely. And with this team in Tampa Bay, you mentioned Tristan Wirfs, which is a interesting one because a lot of Jet fans going back in 2020, that's the guy that they wanted.
Becky
And
Jackson, yeah,
yep, Becton was the pick instead. And Wirf's been fantastic. He's played right tackle, but he's making the switch over
right.
to the left side. How has that transition gone for him so far?
Worse has been outspoken about how difficult it is. He said he's seeing a sports psychologist in the building to kind of get a feel for it and cope with it and in the process. A lot of fans don't like the decision. I personally don't like the decision to move him, but he's a very talented player. He's probably the best player on the Buccaneers roster as far as being an all pro, being perhaps at his peak the second best right tackle in the league. But it's a very new thing for him. Everything, the dynamic entirely switches. The where you put your weight, your hand work, all has to get basically flipped. And Wirfs has not been shy about it. He's talked in depth about how difficult this has been. I think a lot of fans have been noting that and have been a little concerned from that. But the team seems to think Bowles, other coaches seem to think he's doing a great job in that transition because he's very talented. So it's a question mark. It is, and it's one that I don't know if the Bucks needed to have going into this season, but it is a question mark. So that should be interesting.
Yeah, it's funny you mention that because with Mekhi Becton, they taken in the same class and kind of the same thing. Becton starts his career at left tackle, has a pretty nice rookie year, then gets hurt, misses all of 21. Same thing in 2022, and now coming back, a lot of fans just want him to make that transition, go play on the right side. But it's a lot easier said than done. It's not so simple as okay, well, I'm just
Not at
going to do
all.
the same thing from the opposite side. It's you got to reteach yourself some of these things with like your technique and pass blocking and run blocking and all that. So yeah,
Right.
that's curious.
From my perspective, let's say you had a right tackle in Tristan Wirfs and Donovan Smith leaves in free agency, goes to the Chiefs. If you keep Wirfs at right tackle, you have a verifiable right tackle, one of the best in the league, and you have a big question at left tackle. If you move Wirfs, you have a minor question at left tackle, and you still have a big question at right tackle. So that's why, from my perspective, I'm I'm not a huge fan of the move. But I'm also not a GM. I'm not a coach. So we will see how it goes.
No, absolutely. So, all right, I appreciate you joining me today and going through some things to watch for. Where could people find your stuff if they want to follow along with the Bucks this year?
Absolutely. My Twitter, my personal Twitter at River H Wells is where you can find me. It's where I'll post a lot of my updates, my live tweets from training camp, from games, etc. And then Bucs Wire, you can look it up. It's a USA Today property. Looking at Bucs Wire, you can just go there. All my articles are there. Facebook, Twitter, X. Sorry, we've got it all. So you can definitely follow me there if you want to keep updated on Buccaneers news, live tweeting, etc., etc.
Perfect. For River, I am Matt O'Leary. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll
Thank you
talk
for
to you
having
next.
me. Really appreciate it. It was a lot of fun.